If the board chose 10 years, you see that that would generate, based upon the estimate that we've been using of just a little, almost $600 million a year, as you saw earlier, based upon 1 penny. So we built it upon 1%, a 1% increase. So 10 years is $6 billion. Over 20 years, it would generate $12 billion. 25 years, $15 billion. And 30 years, which is the maximum it could be in place by the statutes. 30 years is the maximum it could be in place, and that would generate $18 billion. So then you compare that to the needs list. So those projected revenues to the needs list, and we just simply show what that delta or what it may equate to. And as you see, at less than 25 years, we have a gap. At 25 years, it meets, it matches what we've identified in that local share, and at 30 years, it's a $3 billion, which the board may consider in terms of, I know some of the comments you all have made or questions have resulted in, have we accounted for price escalation and things of that nature. And just to conclude, again, April 26th, that's the date of the public hearing in which the board at that date would make a decision on placing the referendum on the ballot. Should the board choose to do that, then the ballot language has to be submitted to the supervisor of elections in July, and the election day will be November 8th of 2022.
Thank you so much, Byron, and to Mr. Harrison, the Links team. Thank you so much for reaching out and having a conversation with us, looking at maps and trying to figure out sort of a way to grapple with the population growth in District 1, which we now know from the census, it's quantifiable, the population growth. But, you know, when you look at trying to integrate the maps that we got from the transit portion of this conversation and the roadway, it was clear that the priority was really still going into roadway expansion and improvement, which is a cause for concern because I think we understand enough now about how far people are traveling out there to realize that we are creating induced demand and we need to be able to offer options, or else we have created little islands of development. So really when the Links team came to us, my hope was that they would then go to Renzo and talk about how to make something more cohesive between those roadway plans and the transit plans, because in areas of District 1, I know that they've met with resistance when they've tried to increase routes, but it's because we don't have transit-friendly roadways. So, you know, when we look at roadway improvement, once again, I think we've had many, many residents that have come forward and talked about the need for protected bike lanes, and I think we're starting to kind of get that. But also having transit-friendly improvements, and if we're talking about making investments in roadways, we have to consider what we're going to be using those for in totality. So I was hoping to get an integrated plan there, but moving forward, I think at least expressing that and discussing it here provides us with an opportunity to see that that's what would create successful transit, would be, you know, having something that looks appealing to all classes, all working groups, and all residents. I had a question about why there wasn't any consideration for an east-west connection, light rail. I think that, once again, if we just go based on population data, and even looking at our Vision 2050 and what they consider intended growth sectors and existing high-density population centers, that there's got to be better east-west mass transit options. Hearing residents, I think this morning, confirmed that for us. Right, there are residents that are living in hotels day to day out on 192, working all over the county, and I don't know how they're getting there, but it's probably continuing to add to the issues. We know, and I've known since my first week in office, that there are homeless encampments in areas that are still undeveloped, even in pockets, and those people will continue to have issues getting services, getting in, you know, even job interviews if we don't have transit options for them. So I understand the concerns of residents that say we don't want, you know, more buses out here because we don't have room for them on our road. Well, that's still our problem. So that, you know, those things need to be overlapped. And then as far as looking at the draft, and I know that's why we were here today, but I kind of felt like we didn't have an opportunity to sort of vet some of these things the last time, so I really appreciate that also. Concerned about what objective criteria is, and it's the language that's used in the draft ordinance. But objective criteria without a definition really can leave a lot to the imagination, and I'm concerned, for transparency's sake, what does that mean? What does that actual matrix look like? Because, I think at the last workshop, Commissioner Siplin made a really good point that we can have all of this vetted right here with all the information we have, but it doesn't really mean that within, if you look at some of these time frames that we're looking at, that information will continue to carry through. And then how do we make a promise to residents for that, the commitment that we understand now will provide good service to them with this investment. Finally, the citizens oversight. I think one of the things that has become apparent to me after being here and looking at sort of the way that we have wonderful residents that will step up and volunteer for these things, but we have to be really diligent about conflicts of interest. And I know there's a big difference in the legal definition of a conflict of interest and what may prevent somebody from voting from something, and what we've actually got as part of our standards for people's ability or availability and potential appointment for an advisory board. So I would really, I think making sure that this is going to be a referendum that goes to the taxpayers, that they ultimately get to make the decision, having some assurance that there's going to be full transparency and lack of influence in that advisory position would be a lot of comfort to them. I think there's a lot of concern that there's going to be a windfall for potentially deep-pocketed interests, and it's going to be on the backs of everyday citizens, checking out at a register. So any transparency we can provide for how that's going to we'll make sure that there's not going to be any conflicts there, and then also maybe figuring out some way to really articulate what I feel like is still some confusion about the impact fees. We know on this board making a decision to finally sort of ask for what has been needed for a very long time. How do we articulate publicly that this isn't going to be a windfall for the developers that are just now being asked to pay the full amount of what they should have been paid for new development? And, if there is, and I understand there's a very complex formula that goes into place, and there's statutory guidelines for how we look at those transportation costs per development, but if there's a way to articulate that to the public, I think it really would provide also an understanding that this continues to be a potential benefit to residents, not a windfall for new development. And with that, I pass it on down the line.
All right. There were some questions in there, Byron, and I know you took copious notes. If you want to try to address the questions.
So sure. So I'll start about the integration of the transit-friendly roadway. So Renzo and Jim, I'll call on them for that part.
Good morning again. Certainly, Commissioner, as you mentioned, we will continue to work with the Orange County team in developing transit-friendly roadways and transit-friendly systems. I think that is a key part of any mature transit system, and I think that Renzo and the Orange County staff will agree that it is a key part of just a fully integrated system. So I can assure you that we will continue to work with the county staff on that. To go to another question, Commissioner Wilson, that you raised, the concept and the question of an east-west rail, and I'm going to ask, with your permission, Mayor and board members, Tim Crobons to join me here at the podium. Tim is much more articulate than I am on the concept of new rail systems. But I just want to reassure this board that east-west connectivity to our transit network is a very fundamental component of this transit plan. So with the implementation of BRT and systems like that, it's just on corridors like State Road 50 and east-west from, for instance, the airport to the convention center and other key locations like that. The implementation of a new rail system, especially a heavy rail system, can be both very disruptive and very expensive. Just for example, Sunrail, which is our north-south spine, was implemented on an established route. That was a rail system that was in place and has been in place for many years. What I think, and Tim will help me articulate this, what I think that we have designed is a system that is very ripe for the development of such a thing. But I would, Mayor, with your permission, I'll ask Tim to expand on that a little bit. But I do want to assure this board that the concept of east-west connectivity is very, very key to the functionality of this system, and that we will continue to work with Orange County on transit-friendly roadways. Tim?
Morning, Mayor and Commissioners. Tim Crobons with Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates. I've spent the last 35 years working on transit in my career, and working on a lot of rail projects around the country, from commuter rail to heavy rail to light rail, as well as BRT projects, bus rapid transit projects around the country. And what I've found in that experience over the years is that you must learn to crawl before you walk, and you must learn to walk before you run. And this transit system that we've designed kind of does that for you. As Jim articulated, and I thought he did a real good job at this, and that is many of these corridors we've identified, we first phase in high-frequency services with passenger amenities, working with complete streets in these corridors, along with roadway improvements to make these corridors very pedestrian-friendly, accessible to transit. Then, at that point, we phase in bus rapid transit services, and that includes the building of stations with all the amenities that you see in a normal, like light rail station, but you see it at a bus level. What that does, and what the Federal Transit Administration encourages you to do, and all communities to do, is build demand in the corridor. And that is that crawling to walking to running in the corridor, and building transit demand through progressive improvements in transit types of services. Now, many of these corridors may not qualify for commuter rail, which is what SunRail is, but they may qualify for other types of rail, whether it be light rail, streetcar, or whatever in the future. But one of the first things we do in establishing corridors is work with the communities to build these amenities and build the demand such that we can justify the larger investments within transit within these corridors, whatever mode that might be of rail in the future.
And I love the idea of there being, the multimodal, like the idea of being able to move people in many, many ways. I think my question lies in that when you say we need to walk before we run, there are 80,000 new residents in just my district. I think, 40,000 got moved into 2 different districts during redistricting. It doesn't mean that I'm still not concerned about those people. So I'm not sure what more evidence there needs to be about that west growth and the need for alternatives. I think today alone, there are on the agenda how many housing units out there. So that to me feels like a substantial piece of evidence for mapping where, whatever it is, whether it is light rail or the, other alternatives that you mentioned, but to say that we need to create the demand to get the service totally ignores the population data.